Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. Today, well, 'tis the season, and we're going very festive accordingly because who doesn't love Christmas? And indeed, who does not love Christmas food? Many people would argue it's the best bit. I'm tempted to agree, to be honest. So, having loved our conversation on Napoleonic food history last time out, and having received a very positive reaction to it, by the way, if you haven't watched that episode, go and check it out. It's called Food Glorious Food. We have invited Rebecca Earle back on to further discuss the intersections between food and the past with a seasonal twist. Rebecca is a professor of history at the University of Warwick, and though she started off as a historian of the Spanish Americas, she's ended up writing a lot in recent years about the history of food. If you want to read some of that, I think a great place to start would be her book on the potato, which is called Feeding the People: The Politics of the Potato, available from Cambridge University Press. And who knew that you could basically write a history of the world since the 16th century by talking about potatoes? Rebecca, welcome back. Thank you for coming back indeed. How are you?
I'm well, thank you so much for inviting me back.
No problem. It's our pleasure. Also here today is Dr. Luke Reynolds. Luke, welcome.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate the sort of the choke that you get in your voice when you say doctor in front of my name. I do appreciate that. It's like you're fighting it.
Not at
Um,
all.
yeah, no, I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be replacing Zach, and hopefully because of that, we're gonna get let Rebecca actually get a word in edgeways, and you, Josh, get a word in edgeways. I was just thinking, it didn't tweak until just now, but the the remarkably for academe logical progression from a historian of South America to a historian of the potato, that makes perfect sense, actually.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the potato is a quintessential Latin American food, even if it's not what we might think of.
Mm.
I think this might be a Napoleonic Wars podcast first, a first ever time we've managed to go off script before we've even asked the first question. But out of interest, Rebecca, like, how did you start being interested in the potato?
Well, you have an opportunity to withdraw that question before I try to answer
Well,
it.
it's vaguely Christmas related. I mean, we have roast potatoes at Christmas, so
Absolutely. Although I was looking at surveys a year or two ago that was saying that it's quite regional, and some parts of the country would say mashed potato is the way to go for Christmas. There was slight political divides too.
the
Is
politics of
this
the
like
potato.
the maps of how you pronounce scone or scone? Is it sort of that kind of thing?
It's that kind of thing. I don't think it mapped
Okay.
directly onto it, but I think it's exactly like that. Yeah, I think there was, if I'm remembering correctly, I think there was a slight preference among liberal Democrats for mashed potato over roast. But anyway, um,
That's amazing.
That's
That
that's
is quite a remarkable
spectacular.
fact.
can't answer the question about potatoes. Well, I got really interested in how this food, I was interested in food from Spanish America and how it spread around the world and the different sorts of trajectories that different foods had. And I was really interested in the fact that the potato has traveled so widely all over the world. It's grown in virtually every part of the world. Most places have potatoes, and in some places they've become staples rivaling the level of stapleness that they were in their homeland in the Andes. And in fact, the level of potato consumption in some parts of Eastern Europe, etc., is greater than it is in Peru now, which is kind of where potatoes came from. So I was really interested in how did this food become so ordinary all over the world. There was a wonderful comment I remember reading from an Indian artist a contemporary artist who made a really interesting artwork involving potatoes, which I won't describe. But he commented that when he was growing up as a child, kind of out, near Bengal, he was curious whether, everybody ate potatoes, or it was just people, in his part of India who ate potatoes. They were so ordinary to him. And we think of potatoes as completely ordinary, as British. So I was curious about that. But I was also really, really dissatisfied with the kind of history that other, esteemed food scholars were telling about how the potato spread. And the story was just, it was about, um, conservative, unimaginative peasants all over the world, or particularly in Europe, who were, when confronted with something unfamiliar like a potato, said, "Oh, my grandfather never ate that, so I'm not having anything to do with it." And in which ascribed the spread of the potato to Europe, these stories did, to far-sighted, enlightened aristocrats in the 18th century who recognized that the potato was a great food and cajoled the recalcitrant peasantry into eating them. And I thought that's just not how history works. And so I was both really interested in the spread of the potato, and it also really got up my nose the way that story was being told. So that was why.
Buy the book, people. Buy the book, Feeding the People, The Politics of the Potato. Anyway, Zach has evidently infected my brain there with that rabbit hole, so I will return to script. And the first question is, so I mean, in Britain and indeed around the world, so much of the modern Western Christmas is owed to kind of that Dickensian Victorian tradition. And I'm interested to learn how true that is true for food. So, I mean, what are the origins of the modern traditional Christmas dinner? I mean, how traditional is it to have, I'm thinking, for an average person who isn't a vegetarian, turkey, roast potatoes, sprouts, stuffing, and all the trimmings that people might be indulging with.
Well, I mean, we can start by sort of an earliest possible date, in a way, if we were working from first principles, and we would notice that in that list that you just gave, many of the foods are in fact from the Americas. So many of those foods wouldn't have been available to somebody in, well, let's say in 1500, in anywhere in the British Isles, who wanted to eat what would later be considered a traditional Christmas dinner. They couldn't because turkeys, which are from the Americas, hadn't yet been brought back to Europe. You didn't mention cranberry sauce, but we might even, that's become pretty ordinary now. Those are from the Americas. The potatoes, as we've now over-established, are from the Americas. So many of those foodstuffs weren't on the table at any time of year. And we could go on. I mean, if we moved into in the line of puddings, you might think about whether you'd have some kind of bûche de Noël or some kind of, chocolatey dessert. Chocolate is from the Americas, vanilla is from the Americas. So many ordinary foodstuffs people weren't eating anyway. So we can establish that as kind of a first principle, but that doesn't really answer the question of when in the last 500 years did people start eating these foods. And so I think part of the thing to think about is, when do people start eating roast potatoes or a roast turkey or anything like that, on the one hand, and when did people start eating anything in particular for Christmas, on the other hand? So there's also a question about, when did a Christmas menu start to emerge? That's really late. So it was, certainly over the 19th century, there started to be a sense of what were the kinds of things you might expect to have at Christmas. And I can say a little bit about what those things might be. But well into the 20th century, it was kind of your choice. I was looking at commentary from the US. There are lots of culinary traditions that have informed how people eat in the United States, but the things that got talked about in public were often those in the newspapers and were represented on screen and things like that, were often those that came from the British Isles. So you might think in the US that you would also have some sort of reflected version of what would be a traditional British dinner. And I was looking at a newspaper from the early 20th century that was commenting about what you should have for an ideal Christmas dinner. And there was an ideal Christmas dinner described from a digestive point of view, that was, saying what would be, least challenging your digestion, which I think did involve a roast turkey. But then it said, well, if you don't like that, there are lots of other things you could have. You could have a veal curry for your Christmas dinner. That would be all right too. And so there was really a very permissive attitude to what you could put on the table at Christmas and still consider it to be a festive seasonal meal. So that idea really developed quite late.
This is utterly fascinating already, I have to say. I mean, sort of one of these things that I've always found fascinating is the evolution, and it is largely a 19th century evolution of sort of Christmas from communal feasting to what we now think of. I mean, Christmas food as sort of excess food goes back centuries, does it not? It's just the idea that it's specific food that we should have at this time is a new development.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. So there was a wonderful description of what there was an 18th century curate called James Woodford who kept a very elaborate diary which featured a lot of food. He was very interested in what he ate. And let me read you what he had for Christmas in 1773. And so he said for his Christmas dinner, he said he had two fine cods boiled with fried soles, as in, the fish, so two fine cods boiled with fried soles around them and oyster sauce, a fine sirloin of beef roasted, some pea soup, and an orange pudding for the first course. And for the second, we had a lice of wild ducks roasted, a fork of lamb, a salad, and mince pies. So, I mean, that's a lot of food. And
Absolutely.
the only thing that we would probably recognize as distinctly Christmassy from that were the mince pies. And mince pies, I think, were one of the things that for some centuries have been associated with Christmas.
Mm.
But you might not think of, boiled cod or a sirloin steak, perhaps, as something you'd eat for Christmas. But
Well, the thing is the boiled cod I'm with you on, but I was just thinking when you sort of brought that up, and I pulled up my own sort of archive, and sort of uh, my mind always goes to Fezziwig's Ball, right, from The Ghost of Christmas Past in Dickens. And there's that one line, there was cake, there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. And I think it's got some of the same thing. The mince pies are always there, but yeah, I particularly find the sort of for us in the United States, turkey is associated with Thanksgiving, of course, and it does bleed into Christmas, but Christmas almost has a more flexible attitude.
hmm.
There's ham, there's kielbasa, there are people who do beef, and I find the sort of movement towards turkey in the UK away from things like beef and a great piece of cold roast to be utterly fascinating.
Well, so beef is a really good thing to talk about because that also started to become something that was considered traditional over the 19th century. And there's a very nice analysis by a food historian called Nadia Durbach, who's written a very nice book called Many Mouths, which I recommend. And she has a really interesting discussion of some of the protests that took place in poorhouses in London in the 1830s. So we're straying a bit out of the time period, but you like, well, that's okay. We're talking about Dickens. So she writes, so in the 1830s, when the so-called New Poor Law was brought in, which radically transformed and reduced the generosity of the provision for poor people that the British state offered, and I won't go into the details of the New Poor Law, but it was punitive in its model for what the state wanted to do with people who needed state support. And one of the things that was a topic of considerable concern to government was making sure that the food that was being eaten in poorhouses was worse than the quality of the food that people would be eating outside of the poorhouse as a disincentive for people to go and seek relief, which was particularly challenging at times of real hardship when people's food might be inadequate. So the idea that you were going to the poorhouse because you really didn't have enough money to feed yourself, and you were told that the quality of the food that you were eating had to be less good than you were eating before you were starving, you know, makes the quality of the food that you're going to be eating in the poorhouse possibly not sufficient to sustain life. But in any way, as part of this larger onslaught on the quality of food being given to poor people, there was a um, withdrawal of the traditional practice of offering special meals on festive occasions, including Christmas. So poor people were told that they were no longer going to get a special meal on Christmas Day as part of the not just the economy that was being introduced, but in order to remind them that they were lucky to be getting any food at all. And this caused a lot of protest. And what were people protesting for? Well, they said, we want our traditional food back. We want the roast beef and the plum pudding back. So in the 1830s, that was what, if you were going to protest because you wanted your traditional meal, it certainly wasn't going to be a turkey. It was going to be roast beef and a plum pudding. So that's an interesting example of how food worked in real life.
It's a very interesting example. I must say, I never took Luke Reynolds for a food historian, but you were speaking like one for a moment there, and a literary historian as well. You keep your Christmas Carol handy on your desk. Having said that, I know you have a Christmas Carol or Dickens related projects on the podcast in the works, or at least
Yeah,
pre-Dickens.
we should clarify that a lot of what I'm going to be saying on this podcast is drawn from research I'm currently doing for our Christmas Before Dickens episode, which is sort of the pair episode with this, which is looking
Okay.
beyond food at Christmas in the period.
Well, Dickens is a great source for all kinds of things. And I think you mentioned alcoholic beverages a moment ago when you were reading your
Oh
description for
yeah.
Christmas Carol. So that's something else we should talk about.
We absolutely really should.
We're going to get
Yeah,
on to alcohol, I think.
we
We do. We have it lined up. She's preempting us. She knows what the plan is. But I think all of that is to say that there was a connection between certain meals, or at least a certain way of eating and certain times of the meals, but perhaps not a set menu, at least in the way we understand it today, to the extent we understand it today, at least. I'm interested to hear about kind of beyond English tradition, though, because as we mentioned, you have expertise in kind of Spanish American history as well. So, I mean, what were like how different is it if we're talking about kind of Spanish and like Hispanic seasonal tastes, kind of looking back in the past towards like the Napoleonic period and in and around, I suppose, the 18th and 19th centuries. What are the kind of the what are the Spanish doing on all this? What are they eating?
Well, that's a really good question. Actually, that is something that I have to say I don't have a very good answer to. What is worth noting about the celebrations of Christmas in any part of Europe during this period, but also now, is that the days that people celebrate were different. So what were the days that would be the festive meal, the putative festive meal would take place on? That varied and I think was different in different. So I think this I don't know. I think that Epiphany, for example, the 6th of January was a really important holiday in Spain at the time. But the other thing is that Christmas was to some degree a much more compacted holiday. And even in the, sort of high Dickensian period was less of a big deal in a way than it is now. And you see this in all kinds of unusual places that, for example, I've been really struck reading official correspondence from the British Admiralty in the late 18th and early 19th century that people are working, I mean, sometimes on Christmas Day, that people are sending letters on, on business matters from their desk in the Admiralty, and therefore their clerk is working as well, copying out in clean copy, whatever it is they're saying, often on the 25th of December and straight through. So it wasn't that everything paused over Christmas, which I think is also worth bearing in mind if we're thinking about this in terms of the context of the Napoleonic Wars, that warfare didn't cease and administration therefore didn't cease during this period.
No, I think that's really important, and I think the other thing that would be fascinating to explore, and again, it's something I think we'll if you do want to do some research on this, Rebecca, we'll have you on late, at a later point to talk about it. But sort of the Spanish connection is, Spain, France, uh, anywhere where the Catholic Church dominates has much more of a association, not only with the dates, and I think you're dead on that Epiphany was very important for them, but also of, the Catholic countries are much more, they have much more stipulations. The Catholic faith has more stipulations about what you can eat on certain days and what you can't. It's one of the main reasons why, when the New World was founded, fishing was so important, was there was whole days where you could not eat meat, except for those meats that are weirdly classified as fish, for other
Exactly,
purposes.
like a manatee.
Exactly, exactly. I'm gonna drag us as much as as much as I enjoyed that sort of that digression, and I think we do need to have an episode on food tastes across Europe at some point. I think that'd be utterly fascinating. Drag us back to sort of what we were talking about before, and sort of explore the relationship between class and food consumption, both in terms of Christmas food and more generally. Now, in my research, what I've come across, especially in sort of the 16th century, 17th century, and even harkening back to the Middle Ages, albeit harkening back to the Middle Ages in the guise of people in the 16th and 17th century looking back, which is never actually that accurate, is that one of the main Christmas traditions at that point was sort of, the Lord of the Manor opening up his house, putting on a massive spread for everyone. You got fed not necessarily Christmas foods, but you got a lot of it, as I said, and it really reinforced that whole sort of, top-down paternalism of the sort of pseudo-feudal and after period. So I'd love to hear about sort of class and food consumption in this period and how much, as you said, with the poor law, right? How much that is designed to keep everyone in their place.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That part of what made something a festive occasion for most people in Europe over the 18th century, I mean, if not to mention much earlier as well, was the opportunity to eat until you felt really full. That was what made something really a holiday. As much as you might be consuming a particular foodstuff, which might be something that would have a significance to you because it was linked to family ideas, it might be linked to your memories of what you'd eaten in the past. It might have all kinds of symbolic importance. But the thing that was really great about a festivity, whether it was Christmas or a wedding, was the chance to really eat until you were satisfied. And that wasn't something that ordinary people necessarily had an opportunity to do on a daily basis. Wealthy people did. So they had a certain impetus to seek out special and exotic foods to mark an occasion because merely eating to satiety was didn't in itself make it a holiday. So I think that's really important.
You outlined for us earlier the kind of the international heritage of what we consider to be the Christmas dinner, like with cranberries and potatoes, of course, but also perhaps most like obviously with the turkey, which is an American bird. Um, I guess that does beg the question for us. How far were people kind of in our period, the Napoleonic Wars, relying upon exotic ingredients grown outside of Europe in their day-to-day cooking? Because I get the impression that perhaps the 18th and 19th centuries were a bit of a transition in this regard. So what was the balance like between local, national, and foreign foodstuffs in an ordinary person's diet?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's very it was a topic of discussion in the period. So how much food a nation was producing was something that people were really interested, particularly from the 1790s onward. And there were all sorts of shifts that were going on in this period. And so one was that over this period when Britain's so-called Second Empire was really expanding, Britain was increasingly, from a perspective of deliberate government policy, was increasingly looking to source more and more of its foods from abroad, from its colonies ideally, or from elsewhere. So there's a beautiful book by Chris Otter on this called, I think it's called Diet for a Large Planet, in which he talks about the move over the 19th century t away from trying to be self-sufficient within the confines of the state towards a policy of deliberately relying on distant places to be importing food. So that Britain was importing more and more and more of its staple foods, such as wheat from Canada, or, from the antipodes, beef from Argentina, etc., over the course of the 19th century as a policy. And that's kind of the world we live in now, right? That's the world where foods are coming from all over the world, and Britain is not, just to stick with Britain as an example, is, not producing most of its foods. So that was one move that was absolutely going on, starting to happen already in the, kind of at beginning in the late 18th century, people were talking about this. So there was also from the 1790s discussion about whether Britain should be eating the food that it was growing or whether it should be growing commodities such as wheat, exporting them to other countries, and then eating food that was cheaper, probably food that was still grown in Britain, but that was a cheaper food stuff. So there was still the sort of focus on exports and imports and how much food should be being consumed within the country and how much should the country be shipping its food abroad, how much should it be importing. So these were all really topical discussions. So your question was, how much food from abroad were people consuming? And so I think that the staples that most people were eating were still being grown in this period, were still being grown in Britain, except in periods of catastrophic collapse. I mean, during the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, there were some efforts to import um, maize meal from the Americas, which didn't go down terribly well. But generally speaking, the staples that people were eating, well, what we might consider staples, sort of starchy foods, etc., were being grown locally. Same for vegetables, etc. What ordinary people were consuming a lot of, which were not being grown in the British Isles, were what are sometimes called colonial groceries. So that's sugar, coffee, tea, chocolate in the form of hot chocolate. Those foodstuffs, all of which were grown outside of the British Isles, outside of Europe, in European colonies, were being ever more widely consumed because these foods were being grown, generally speaking, with enslaved labor. The price was falling and falling and falling over this period, to the extent that some scholars have argued that very sweet tea actually was a staple. That was a staple food of working people, certainly by the early 19th century. And there's been pretty convincing research showing how people up and down the country were consuming ever more quantities of these foods that were really becoming an important part of their daily diets. So that all these people, you could say, were having sort of colonial experiences, even if they were never leaving the British Isles, because their diet was revolving more and more around these imported foodstuffs.
It's funny. This is such a for people like you and me and Josh and a lot of our listeners. This is going to come as sort of yes, we know this, but in a way, there's an entire branch of this that thinks of this as a 20th century concept, right? Globalization and all of that. And I'm reminded of the 1926 Christmas campaign by the Empire Marketing Board. It
Hmm.
explicitly pushed for an Empire Christmas pudding, right? And they sort of outlined where each ingredient came from. So South African raisins, Canadian flour, Australian sultanas, Demerara sugar. And my favorite part about this is it goes through this whole list, and at the end it says, "Buy Empire goods. Ask, is it British?" Question mark. Um, and sort of that wonderful delineation. But the thing is, in 26, right, we're talking about a desperation to keep an empire together in the aftermath of the First World War. We are talking about the peak of imperial expansion. Um, but in the Napoleonic Wars, we're talking about a world at war in a way that it wasn't at war in the interwar period of the 20th century, unless, of course, you were in China at the time and places like that. Um, but part of the Napoleonic Wars, as our listeners will know, are two of the first truly global trade wars. Blockades and things like that. So I'm curious for the politics of this, although not so much on the class level, but on the international level. In the period we're talking about, the beginning of the 19th century, what was the balance like within the consumption of foreign foodstuffs between ingredients that grown from power's own colonies and those received from trade with other countries? And also tied into that, because I know you can talk about this, is sort of an early 19th century version of that sort of paranoia of should we be able to manage this ourselves? Should we exist entirely from our own colonies? Does that make us less vulnerable? Sort of a food version of sort of, should we produce our own oil kind of thing today?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean this was a topic of explicit discussion. And that was, I mean, that was why to go back inevitably, as one does, if I to the potato. That's part of the reason that the potato became such a resonant foodstuff in this period, because it was seen as being something that could be grown easily by people themselves, and they could then eat the produce of their own husbandry. And that would then allow the country to ideally export any wheat that was being grown to some other less far-sighted country that was then going to be reliant on British exports of grain to its own detriment. So there was this sort of sense of food security, certainly in the period, that was being discussed increasingly, which is not to say that countries didn't have to import grain at certain moments, but that the goal was that you didn't have to do that. But this was also coming out of a sort of mercantilist vision of balance of trade. So the kind of mercantilist idea that you wanted to be having your balance of trade favorable had a food dimension to it. In fact, food was at the heart of a lot of these discussions. A lot of the debates about political economy were very concretely tied to the grain trade. They weren't abstract. They were about food because that was the key thing. I'm conscious that we've strayed very far from Christmas, so I don't want to shirk my obligation to talk about Christmas foods, but um I'm
I
also
think
very
I
happy
think
to
uh I think Josh is about to yank us back on track, as is his job in this podcast. But yeah, no, I think you're dead on. And I can't every as you talk about this, all I can think about is sort of, this the looming threat of the corn laws over my over the head at all times.
No, I mean, I will, I guess, yank us back on track if that's how you put it. But even so, I do think this question of like the internationalization of food is probably quite relevant to Christmas because, for reasons we talked about earlier in terms of the evolution of the Christmas dinner. We're talking about kind of an international dish coming together, really, on top of a kind of what's a festival in the sense of the word that there's a feast at the center of it really. So I mean I do think it is definitely still relevant, but returning to at least in the direction of Christmas, we threatened a discussion of alcohol earlier, and I think there's a lot to be said about alcohol historically and also in its relation to Christmas because as I said earlier it's a festival and it's a time of drinking really for everyone. So can you tell us more about alcohol in the Napoleonic period? Again, this I guess is this question that extends beyond Christmas. Um, because it seems that like today, I mean, alcohol's consumed in so many different forms and settings, and it has its own positive and negative connotations in all of them. So from drunken sailors to members of high society sipping champagne. So I imagine that was as much the case then. So for want of a better way of phrasing this, what were the uses? I guess that might be the word of alcohol in our period. What different ways were people consuming it, and what stereotypes were attached to it?
Well, people, yeah, absolutely were consuming lots of alcohol. This was a period of enormous smuggling. So there were excise duties being imposed on alcohol, and there was huge trade in alcohol going around all through Europe. I've been looking at the wonderful collection of prize papers, as they're called, in the National Archives in outside of London, in Britain, that have um, unbelievably rich documentation about the many, many ships that were captured by the British during periods of war and taken as prize into different British ports and then evaluated in terms of whether they were a legitimate seizure or not. And these list the cargoes of these many ships that are captured. And so if you look at the details of any particular capture, it'll tell you what was on these ships. And all sorts of things were on these ships. But among those all sorts of things, there was an awful lot of alcohol. So red wine, white wine, brandy, all sorts of things were bobbing about across the oceans and seas around Europe all through this period. So there was a really lively trade, some of it legal, some of it smuggled in alcohol. And of course, people could brew their own beer, which they did. And I mean, beer was something you generally speaking brewed. Um, you didn't, generally speaking, that wasn't something that was subject to international trade, partly because of bottling. technical challenges, but that's a whole other topic. So lots of alcohol was being consumed, and it was also politicized and what sorts of alcohol people were drinking or what sorts of beverages people were drinking had all kinds of social meanings. So you mentioned drunken sailors, for example, and so there were certainly stereotypes of alcohol being something that was part of the sailors' way of being. But sailors were also drinking hot chocolate. You know, that was something else they drank. It was part of their ration in some parts of the world. So sailors weren't just consuming alcohol, and they weren't necessarily consuming um, the same sorts of alcohol at all times of day. So if you read captain's logs, they might say if something particularly splendid had happened on the ship, the captain would say everybody would be given a ration of something to drink as a little celebration. And we know from the ration regulations of how much alcohol sailors were supposed to be getting, that they were entitled to a really hefty quantity of booze on a daily basis as part of their rations. So there was certainly a lot of alcohol being consumed, but it was being consumed and doled out in different ways, where sometimes it was just part of what you were consuming, sometimes it was part of a special reward if you got a dose of something outside of the normal rations. So there was a whole world of alcohol on board ship. But to bring it back to Christmas, one of the things that it seems to me was a feature of Christmas, but I mean, not uniquely a Christmas thing, but something that was a sort of Christmas drink was hot alcohol. So mulled things, or sometimes they were called burnt wine or burnt sherry. These were things that had I think, a somewhat Christmassy quality to them. So we're familiar with mulled wine, and that has a really long tradition. It goes back to ancient Greece and Rome. Some of these hot, sweetened drinks in the Middle Ages were called things like hippocras, which were spice. I mean, they were like sort of like a mulled wine in a way, hot and sweet and spiced. And they were called hippocras probably after Hippocrates, the um, mythicus Greek doctor whose name gave us the Hippocratic Oath. So these were very ancient drinks, and the fact that they were called hippocras also kind of hints at the fact that these hot, sweet alcoholic drinks were seen as having medicinal benefits, which is just great. If you think of, if you think on Christmas when you're having your second glass of mulled wine, and you can think this is just really medicinal. This is absolutely full of good stuff, and that was the thinking. There were all sorts of things that hot, sweet, spiced alcoholic drinks were supposed to do for you. They would, sort out menstrual problems. They would increase libido. They would, benefit you in all sorts of ways. So that seems to be a long established way of drinking alcohol that was certainly popular in the period and well up into the 19th century. You were mentioning Dickens before, and Dickens has many splendid descriptions of all sorts of hot, sweet, or spiced alcohols that people can drink. And I'd be happy to talk through. I think when we spoke before, you were saying, can you give some recommendations? And I would be happy to recommend some particularly splendid Christmassy hot drinks that people might consider trying in their own homes.
We're definitely going to want some recommendations and some recipes at the end. Yeah, Hippocras is utterly fascinating. I've come across mentions of it being used in the same way as we now use tea or coffee, right, to warm up and wake up on a cold morning and sort of
Mm.
get that blood going. But on this subject of hot alcohol and the sort of especially going back a little bit to the sailors, but I think this is something that can apply to elsewhere as well. Um, I'm genuinely curious if the rum ration or the alcohol ration and this hot chocolate ration were ever mixed. Do we have accounts of spiked hot chocolate
Yep.
uh going on at this point? Because at this point, hot chocolate was a lot, in many places, was a lot less sweet than it is today, by definition. And adding rum to it might have actually made it sweeter. So I am curious if you have encounters on land or at sea of sort of spiked hot chocolate as we know it.
That's a really interesting question. I have not seen that. So I have not seen any comment of either sailors at mixing their different rations, nor do I recall seeing recipes, but I haven't been looking for them in particular. I have a friend who works on chocolate. I'll ask her. I'll ask her about that. That's yeah.
I'm just this has just sprung to my into mind now, but Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie in The Peasants of Languedoc, which is a quite a famous historical book looking at early modern peasants. He has this wonderful fact in it, which is the average peasant in Languedoc in 1840 drank between 1.5 and 2 liters of wine every day. Which wow, you can take a moment to consider that. But there's three things that I guess that raises. Firstly, I dread to think how much that must have become at times like Christmas. Secondly, and it's important to qualify, alcohol was obviously much weaker than it is today back then. So it was not the fact that everyone was an alcoholic. It was just more to do with the fact that um you could drink much more of it than you can because the percentage is was just lower. But thirdly, alcohol seems to have been consumed very differently than it is today, given the fact that it is something that seems to be drunk every day and often throughout the day. You mentioned like the anecdote of the sailor, or the captain like celebrating with his crew if a certain kind of event has happened, and that to me shows that it's just something that can kind of just happen at any time in the day, and it often might happen, you know, once, twice, three times throughout a day. So what? How different do you think the consumption of alcohol is to today? With all that in mind, do you think that was it is it true to say it was altogether just drank like more regularly, less kind of discreetly, if that's the word, like it is today? They didn't save it as much for special occasions, or is that a fallacy?
Well, this is a huge topic. So I mean, there's no really single answer to that. So there was a time when historians were when there was a type of historian who was really interested in trying to work out whether the caloric intake of people in the past was adequate to sustain, basic human functioning, whether it was excessive, etc. So there's a whole sort of school of historians who worked on trying to estimate people's caloric intake using whatever records they could find, usually based on institutions. So sailors' rations were a good source of data on that because you could get um, lists of what people were supposed to be able to afford or supposed to be eating, or public schools sometimes had good records going way back of what the students were eating. So people would try to then using modern calorie counts, they would try to tot it all up and they would say, oh, most people were only getting 1,200 calories a day and they were engaging in heavy labor, which would have required 3,000 calories. So they were obviously stunted and, probably their mental function shut down. And, there was a whole branch of scholarship that was trying to work out whether people were basically starving all the time. And the alcohol side of this was sort of part of it. There were people who were trying to work out whether people were basically drunk all the time on the basis of how much alcohol they must have been consuming. And then there were other scholars who would come along and say the sorts of things that you were saying, like, no, 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 the level of alcohol was actually, it was much lower proof, or they were watering the wine very heavily, and so they weren't consuming anything like the quantity of alcohol that it would appear they were, or that the um, calculations that were being made of people's caloric intake were incorrect because they didn't take into account things that didn't feature in the official um, diets that they were using, but that people were adding themselves. There's a whole snarl of scholarship about that. And then further complicating it are the people who then try to recreate historic alcohol recipes and brew up alcohols from the past. And some of that scholarship has suggested that actually alcohol was so quite strong that it wasn't all, sort of 1%, 2% small beer, and that some of it was quite alcoholic. And there's some really interesting work by a scholar called Craig Muldrew, who's calculated the the role, the percentage of the agricultural laborers' diet that came from alcohol in the early modern period, and says that it was really high, and that alcohol was a really important part of the diet of the agricultural laborer, and that that's important not because of the alcohol, but because of the calories. And so that argument says that actually alcohol and particularly beer, was a really important source of calories for laborers, and that we might think, oh, it's empty calories, beer. And he says, no, 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 there's no such thing as an empty calorie in the early modern period, if you're for most people. What you want is as many calories as you could possibly get if you're an agricultural laborer. And so the fact that they were drinking a lot of beer with a lot of calories was great. And he sort of implies beer was part of what fueled the agricultural revolution in early modern England and made possible all of the transformations which made Britain more productive in foodstuff. So how alcoholic alcohol was, and therefore how caloric it was, are actually really important historical questions about what things were like in the past, which again has taken us very far away from Christmas foods, but you asked, so I think I
Uh,
answered that question.
you absolutely did, and I don't think we're that far from Christmas foods because it makes me think actually of um both what you're saying now and a point you made earlier about the relationship between kind of festivals and calories, which I think you just hinted at, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. Because I can't I think you might have referenced someone who raised this idea, but the the festival is kind of, or like for example Christmas is an opportunity for people to kind of to eat until they're full, or to get like to kind of somehow match some sort of caloric deficit, if I understand you. So can you perhaps like reflect a little bit more for us about that point, what that tells us about kind of consumption at times of Christmas, and I guess what you make of it?
Well, I think, yeah, so I don't know whether I want to frame it as a caloric deficit or not, but certainly that people were not satisfied with what they were eating a lot of the time because people were hungry a lot of the time. So it's, I mean, not everybody at all time, not all ordinary people at all times, but this was an experience that was part part of life. And just being comfortable was a pleasure. And there's a nice 16th century Christmas ballad, an English ballad, in which the ballad celebrates that some of the great things about Christmas are that you can have cake and you can have a warm fire and you can have good warm brown beer. So, again, the hot alcohol again is brought in as a pleasure. But, just a warm fire, that's a really nice thing. And that's part of what you enjoy about Christmas. So I think comfort in general is really important. And it's important to us. That's part of what we think about what makes a holiday special is feeling comfortable, however that might register for us. But I think for people in the 18th and 19th centuries, certainly warm alcohol was one of the things that might make something feel comfortable.
I think part of this is it is crucial to remind us, and I don't want to fall into the trap of being, sort of, oh, the everything before the modern age was terrible and awful, but we are so used to central heating and sealed rooms and caloric sufficiency that we forget what was special and what was comfort in many ways.
People worked really hard. I was I listened to a different podcast a little while ago about the history of washing up. And it was talking about, I mean, pointing out something really obvious, which is that if until indoor plumbing was not just invented, but was implemented, anything you washed up, somebody, probably a woman, was hauling that water
Yeah.
from a well, from some other source, and that water is really heavy. And they made the nice comparison of emptying out a dehumidifier, if you happen to have a dehumidifier anywhere, and that just carrying out a couple of liters of water and carrying it up or downstairs reminds you of how heavy water was. So just having enough water actually was required a workout, and that's more, energy you're burning, I suppose. So, but
Absolutely.
life was physically demanding in different ways.
Yeah, very much so. So I've got a question that hasn't been cleared by Josh, but I think he'll once he hears it, he'll sort of crack a smile because it is, he said earlier he doesn't think of me as a food historian. Well, this question is dead down my bailiwick. Um, and it's basically food and celebration as propaganda. Was to what extent, or was at all, Christmas and Christmas food used in any way to define Britishness, especially during the wars and immediately afterwards? Sort of was there that sort of, uh, you know, here's what we're doing, here's the good stuff. And you won't find that in that godless Bonapartist state, or you won't find that in Europe because they're starving. Is there propaganda associated with this at this point? There certainly is later, but I'm curious about this point.
Well, that's a really good question. I have not seen um, comments that refer specifically to Christmas, but there may be such things that I haven't seen. But certainly, and you're probably familiar with them on this podcast, lots and lots of caricatures that contrast the starving Frenchman and the well-fed, indeed enormously fat Briton during this period. So there's certainly lots of that. And so food is definitely one of the things that the British are using to try to differentiate between British, liberty and French slavery. There's the famous cartoon showing a skeletal Frenchman shivering in front of an almost non-existent fire, gnawing on, is it a leek or I think it's a leek that, and there's a contrasting with a John Bull type figure who's sitting down at a table to have an enormous side of beef. So there's lots and lots of food being used in propaganda, which is also sort of I mean, it's an interesting reversal of the way in which patriotic Britons in the 18th century had spoken about French food in a slightly different way in previous wars. So one of the important cookery books of the mid 18th century by Hannah Glass, has a diatribe in the introduction against French cooking as being extravagant and wasteful. So the
Mm.
image of French cooking in the mid 18th century in Britain was of a site of enormous waste and excess, and how French chefs would use pounds and pounds of butter to fry a single egg, and that this was just wasteful. So this was the idea that the French were starving was not a long-standing trope in this period. It was a distinct response to
Mm.
Napoleon.
You have this fantastic interest in cookbooks, Rebecca, historical and present, and I know about that largely because my own university, you had this project where you tried to get, or you got lots of students to kind of make their submissions to a Warwick cookbook, which I thought was fantastic. And it makes me wonder when you're dealing with kind of historical cookbooks or from whichever period, do you ever try out the recipes which you're kind of using for your research? And this relates very much to the conversation we are having at the start of the last interview with Zach. But if so, how accurate can you be and do you try to be um, when you're like replicating those recipes?
Oh yeah, I do like trying if it looks like a nice recipe, I do try it. Or if it looks like something that I think is going to be interesting to me research wise. And there are some great recipes. And I'm far from being the only person who does this. I mean, it goes without saying. And so some of the cookery writers who are like real cookery writers who publish cookbooks that people actually could recognize, rather than sort of amateur produced cookery books. Some of these people routinely try out recipes and reference them and will say, oh, I got this recipe from this or that historic source. Jane Grigson was particularly well known for doing that. Nigella Lawson has referenced all recipes that she's got. So it's something that people do not just out of a sort of scholarly interest, but because they're interested in good food, and people in the past often ate really good food. So there are lots of recipes like that. I'm not the kind of historical reenactor of recipes that some people are. There's some people who have made it a life's work in a way to be figuring out how people cooked food in the past and who have developed an enormous expertise on what it was like to cook things, what things tasted like, and that, we when we were talking about roast meat before, and we think we roast meat, right? We think we might have maybe some people will have a roast beef for Christmas or a roast turkey, and we roast it by putting it in the oven, right? But that wasn't really how you roasted beef. You roasted beef in front of a fire, and you would turn it around perhaps on a spit. And what we make is baked meat, which actually makes sense if you think about it. Everything else we cook in the oven, we tend to, if we put a cake in the oven, we're baking it. We don't say, I'm roasting my cake, right? But when we put our piece of meat in the oven, we think that we're roasting it. But it actually has a different outcome when you put something in the oven with the kind of heat that you get. And people who do these kinds of cooking things in front of an open fire tell me that the flavor that you get from meat that's been actually roasted in this way is incomparable to what you get when you get it out of the oven. I don't know if any of you have had this opportunity to eat that sort of roast, a roast joint, perhaps turned on a spit.
Not turned on a spit, but my father does every bit of meat cooking in his household on ceramic barbecues, which
Oh.
have that directional heat rather than all around. So I can say it's unbelievably tasty. And I think also the very fact of that it's being roasted over wood charcoal, and so that adds to the flavor in ways that we're not used to with sort of clean gas or electric ovens. Okay, so that on the understanding that you are not out on a Friday night crouched over a fire with a spit in your hand, or you've got one of those wonderful sort of giant hamster wheels to put a Jack Russell Terrier in to run it around and spin for you. Um, do you know of, or can you leave us with any historical recipes that might be worth trying out this Christmas season? If we've got a listener who's been I'm gonna be stereotypical for a minute because about 75 to 80% of our listeners are male. So if we have a listener whose wife or significant other or mother has been yelling at them for years because they're not contributing to the Christmas dinner, and they want to throw something together. What's the historical recipe you think we should go with?
Well, I think you should make one of these hot, spiced, warm, sweetened, mulled alcohols, in case that
Mm.
hasn't been, in case I haven't suggested that clearly enough. So, and one thing that I think is really good is a version of mulled wine which is called a bishop. And you were mentioning the Christmas Carol. You were
Mm.
mentioning Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and they, Scrooge and Bob Cratchit, have a bowl of smoking bishop at the happy conclusion of the story. So what's a bishop? The signature ingredient for that is some kind of roasted citrus fruit and some port added to the sweetened hot wine will give you a bishop or a smoking bishop. And there are all kinds of variants. So if you use a Seville orange, for example, one of those bitter oranges, that was called a pope. It wasn't a bishop. And if you use white wine instead of red wine and you add some cardamom and you roast clementines as your roasted fruit, then you get a cardinal. So they're all, you can go through the hierarchy of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, making various forms. You can make a smoking bishop or a pope or a cardinal. They're really nice. And you can imagine hot white wine, some cardamom, roasted clementines, some sugar, honey. Very, very nice. So that's one thing that I would recommend you try. And you can, I mean, there are recipes online. There are recipes from the 19th century. I could send you a couple of historic recipes if you want one to put on the website
Yes, please.
for one or another sort of bishop. And the other thing that I think is really nice that you might consider is something called lamb's wool, which was a traditional Twelfth Night drink. And that's one of these warm ales. So rather than using a wine, you'd use an ale, and it also has roasted fruit in it. So you would that one, the roasted fruit is little apples. So you roast, or actually more accurately, we might say bake some little apples, and you warm up some ale, and then you add some sugar or some honey and some nutmeg. And then when you want to serve it, you serve yourself one of these little apples in a little ladle full of some nice hot warm ale, and you eat the whole thing. And so it's got an element of fruit as well as being nicely alcoholic and warmed and spiced and sweet. And it has a lovely name, I think, Lambswool. It was a tradition, that was a traditional thing to have if you were wassailing as well, I think. So I would recommend both of those as really nice drinks.
I expected an answer along the lines of food, but I think I prefer your answer even more, and perhaps the proverbial or the people at home that Luke is speaking of would would as well prefer Rebecca's suggestion. There you have it. Make your own historical alcoholic concoction this Christmas and call it Napoleonic Scholarship. They all sound very tasty. Rebecca, it wasn't always Napoleonic and it wasn't always Christmas related, but it was absolutely fascinating, and that's why we brought you back for this episode. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Rebecca Earle is Professor of History at the University of Warwick, and her book Feeding the People, The Politics of the Potato is available at Cambridge University Press. Folks, thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next time, and Merry Christmas.
Folks, as the festive season approaches, consider whether you'd be willing to do any of these things to spread the Napoleonic cheer. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Then sign up to our newsletter by contacting us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get the regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a novel Christmas gift for the Napoleonicist in your life? Check out our merch via the link in the description in order to support our work while giving your loved ones something distinctive this winter. If you aren't in a position where you can dig into your pockets, then believe me, we totally get it. But that doesn't mean that you can't thank us for the episodes that you've enjoyed in a different way. All podcast platforms have ways for you to leave your reviews, so just spare us 2 minutes and leave a review wherever you listen to us. It makes a world of difference in boosting our international ranking and widening our reach. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and develop new exciting documentary channels. So if you want to be kept entertained on a daily basis when it comes to Napoleonic nerdery, prices start from just £2 a month. And you can, if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and the enigmatically named Zed. The Chiefs of Staff: that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.